Today I'm tackling some of the biggest myths and misconceptions in the world of karting. You've probably heard these before, they're pretty common. Things like looking behind your shoulder, tucking down the straight. Well, I'm going to be using my karting experience and even some experimenting to break it all down. I'll give my opinion for each of these myths, and at the end of each one, I'll say if it's a fact, like this is definitely true, or a myth. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Stick around at the end of the video, and hope you guys enjoy. So our first myth for today is more laps equals better testing. A lot of people say to maximize your track time during test days and get in as many laps as possible. In my opinion, cranking out hundreds of laps at the track might sound productive, but it's not as effective as you think. Sure, it's good for endurance, but after 150, 200 laps or so, you're just risking burnout. And that's not to mention the unnecessary wear on your chassis and engine. I'd say focus on quality over quantity. Test different setups, different driving techniques, and learn from every lap instead of driving aimlessly. If you're just driving on crappy tires for 100 laps, you really won't get much out of it. Don't believe the hype. I've seen a lot of drivers tell me they've done 200 laps in a day and show off how much driving they've done. It's okay to try it for endurance training purposes, but for testing things, it's not the most useful. You can get burnt out if you don't take care of yourself. So this is definitely a myth for me. So our next one we have here is looking over your shoulder is bad. You've probably heard this advice before, and for a good reason. Any seasoned or skilled racer will tell you that racing is all about mental ability, maybe even more so than physical ability. The psychological effect of checking behind you in a race is greater than you may think. Doing it actually shows a weakness to your competitors and is pretty distracting since it gets in your head quite a lot. Seeing a driver slowly start reeling you in. It's not uncommon to see drivers start making mistakes right after checking behind them. I'm even guilty of it myself. I do, however, think it's okay to look behind you once in a while to see where you're at, like compared to your competition, but only if you really need to. And you want to do it occasionally to strategize what your next move is going to be. Such as, if you should defend or not on the final lap. That's obviously pretty important to know. So there are definitely some exceptions to this. When the racing gets more spread out, though, you should focus more on running your own race and hitting your marks. A rule I have for myself, if I find myself doing this a lot, like midway through a race, is to just do it once a lap or less, and only on the straightaway. Another really good way of telling if someone is really close behind you without actually looking is to listen to the engine noises. I do this quite a lot. It works pretty well. Most of the two-stroke engines are pretty loud. You can kind of tell if you listen closely. So this is definitely not a myth, but to an extent, I'd say. Our next one is tucking down the straightaway makes you faster. Now, I did a whole video on this, and it turns out it's actually pretty controversial. The comments were pretty divided. Some people said that it doesn't do anything and it's completely useless, and some say that it helps them quite a lot, even claiming to drop a couple of tenths down the straightaway by doing it. Long story short is it really depends on the track and what class you're in, but overall it doesn't really help your lap time, and if it does, only by a minuscule amount. It's considered human DRS in karting, but it really doesn't give you much of a boost. But I would still do it, and you may be wondering why. It's more of a psychological boost. Like I explained in that video, it helps put you in a more racy mindset and pushing 100%. So I'd say this is more of a fact, but for a different reason than what you would expect. Now let's move on to another very popular misconception, which I swear to God I cringe so hard every time I hear, and that is racing isn't a sport. This one is pretty self-explanatory to a lot of people watching, but I've talked to some people that still don't consider karting a sport. I'd be telling them about my latest races I went to, and they're like, "What? Go-karting? I did that at the fair." Or even worse, some people think racing as a whole is not a sport. Karts are cars, it's just driving in circles. For most of you who are subscribed, this is probably a complete no-brainer. There's no doubt that pro kart racing is pretty physically demanding, even more so than some car racing. That's why F1 drivers always practice in shifter karts to stay sharp during breaks from Grand Prix events. In two-stroke karts, you've got to have extremely quick reaction times and reflexes. One small movement on the steering wheel or pedals can result in you losing places or crashing. And the amount of stress it puts on your body is pretty serious. But just how strenuous is it? Well, I put a Fitbit on for a quick Rotax practice session, and while I was driving, I recorded around 180 beats per minute. That's around as much as marathon runners get during a race and what basketball players get during games. Also, the built-in G meter on the Micron I was using measured over 2 Gs. That was during a practice. I wasn't even 10 laps long. Now let's double the laps, add 30 more karts chasing you down, and now the real sport begins. High-level karting has some of the best drivers in the world taking part, and the amount of skilled drivers in a race can be very high. I think what makes racing a sport, and a great one at that, is that it's not anything like other sports. Instead of having two teams pitted against each other, there are many different teams with hundreds of drivers racing in a battle royale to see which singular driver comes out on top. The stakes are extremely high and the room for error can be pretty low. So, as I proved, it is physically demanding, and it is very competitive, with high stakes as well. I still don't know how it can't be a sport at this point, so this is a huge myth for this one. No argument there. With that being said, that's all for today. Thank you all very much for watching, and feel free to comment your opinion on these karting myths and misconceptions. Subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.